Do you believe in the paranormal? Some say ghosts are just figments of our imagination, but what if I told you that sometimes the unexplained lingers just beyond the veil of the ordinary? What I'm about to share with you is no fabricated story. This is a chilling chapter from my own life, an experience that left an indelible mark on my childhood and still sends shivers down my spine whenever I think about it. It all started in a house that seemed ordinary on the surface, but hid a darkness that none of us could escape. Before we dive into this terrifying journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story. And hit the bell icon to never miss an update from us as we unravel more real paranormal experiences that will keep you awake at night. When I was about 12 years old, I experienced a series of events that have haunted me ever since. Sleep was a struggle. I was plagued by night terrors, waking up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, and unable to remember the dreams that terrified me so. Rarely did I sleep through an entire night, and it was during one of these restless nights that something unforgettable occurred. One particular night, after hours of tossing and turning, I decided to get up and use the bathroom. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy and alive. As I shuffled half asleep to the bathroom, my only thought was to empty my bladder and return to the fragile comfort of my bed. I sat down, barely awake, when something in my peripheral vision caught my attention. There, by the other door to the bathroom, stood a man. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring directly at me. My breath caught in my throat. He was gaunt, with hollow cheeks and little to no hair, dressed in a tattered gray jumpsuit. One of his hands gripped a crutch, the kind that looked like it had seen years of wear. His eyes, sunken and lifeless, bore into mine. Time seemed to stop. My body froze in place, but my mind screamed for me to move. The next thing I remember, I was in the basement where my parents slept, hysterical and trembling. How I got there, I have no idea. It was as though I had been teleported. My dad, groggy and irritated, tried to calm me down as I stammered out my story. Though skeptical, he eventually went upstairs to check the bathroom and the adjoining kitchen. He found nothing, but the fear in my eyes must have convinced him to let me sleep on the couch in their room. I didn't sleep at all that night, my ears straining for every creak, every whisper of movement. Days passed, and though I was still shaken, life went on. Then, another event occurred, one that deepened the mystery of our house. Late one evening, as I lay in bed struggling to sleep, I heard the faint sound of crying. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. A child's sobs carried through the stillness of the night. I sat up, my heart pounding, and looked around. In the dim light, I saw her. A small girl, no older than 7 or 8, stood in the corner of my room. Her back was to me, and her tiny shoulders shook with each muffled sob. Her dress was old-fashioned, white but stained and tattered, as though it had been dragged through dirt and time. Her long, dark hair hung in tangled strands over her face and shoulders. I tried to speak to her, my voice quivering. "Are you okay? Who are you?" She didn't respond. Instead, she turned her head slightly, just enough for me to see the edge of her face. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were black voids that seemed to swallow the light. I froze, unable to breathe or move. The next thing I knew, she was gone, and I was left staring at the empty corner where she had stood. The following night, sleep felt impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside, made my skin crawl. But exhaustion eventually claimed me. Sometime in the dead of night, I stirred, sensing a presence. My eyes fluttered open, and I saw her again. She was standing right next to my bed, her empty black eyes staring down at me. My scream caught in my throat as I quickly pulled the blanket over my head. I peeked through one of the tiny holes in the fabric, my body trembling. She hadn't moved. Instead, she bent down and reached for my dolls that were scattered at the foot of the bed. One by one, she picked them up and began to play with them, giggling softly. The sound was hollow, like a broken music box. When morning came, I told my dad about the girl. He dismissed it as a bad dream until it happened to him. One night, he woke up to see the same shadowy figure standing at the foot of his bed. She didn't move, didn't speak, but he felt an overwhelming wave of sadness and dread. From that moment on, he believed me. Not long after, my dad found a new job in another town. We moved out of that house, leaving behind the eerie encounters that had turned our nights into nightmares. Life gradually returned to normal, though the memories of that house lingered in the back of my mind. Years later, I stumbled upon an article about our old home. It detailed a tragic story. A family had lived there years before us, and they had all died in a horrific murder-suicide. The father, driven by madness, had killed his wife and daughter before taking his own life. The little girl's name was Emily, and her description matched the figure that had haunted me. Now, every time I think about that house, I feel a chill run down my spine. The spirits of that family were trapped there, their anguish etched into the very walls. I often wonder if the new occupants ever experienced the same things we did, or if the ghosts had finally found peace. The night it began, I was 13, and my cat, Luna, nestled beside me as always. Her warm purring was my lullaby, a gentle rhythm that carried me to sleep. That night, however, would mark the end of those peaceful slumbers. I drifted into a dream, or what I thought was a dream. It was seamless, unnervingly real. I woke up in my room, bathed in the faint glow of my nightlight. My phone lay on the bedside table, exactly where I'd left it. Instinctively, I reached for it. As soon as my thumb brushed the screen, it unlocked, bypassing the usual password. The camera app launched unbidden, flipping to the front-facing camera. At first, I saw only myself, disheveled from sleep, illuminated by the faint screen glow. Then, the background came into focus. Behind me, a woman hovered. Her skin was ashen, her face contorted in an expression of pure rage and anguish. Her mouth was wide open, an unending scream pouring from her, though no sound reached my ears. Her eyes were hollow voids, leaking darkness that seemed to ooze and writhe. My body froze, paralyzed with terror. I couldn't turn, couldn't breathe. Her hand reached out toward me, skeletal fingers stretching unnaturally long. Suddenly, I was yanked from the dream, screaming and drenched in cold sweat. My heart pounded against my ribs as I scanned the room. There was nothing there. Luna, startled by my outburst, stared at me with wide eyes. Trembling, I whispered to myself that it was just a nightmare. A horrific, vivid nightmare. The next night, Luna didn't curl up beside me. Instead, she perched at the edge of my bed, her fur bristling and her eyes locked on a single corner of the room. It was the same corner where the woman had appeared in my dream. Luna growled low in her throat, a sound I'd never heard from her before. Her tail swished violently, and her ears flattened against her head. I tried to coax her back to her usual spot, but she refused, her focus unbroken. Unease seeped into me, but I pushed it aside, chalking it up to residual fear. That night, I slept fitfully. My dreams were plagued by fleeting glimpses of the woman, her skeletal hands reaching for me, her empty eyes staring into my soul. Each time I woke, Luna was still there, growling at the corner. A chill hung in the air, far colder than it should have been for a summer night. By the third night, the atmosphere in my room had shifted entirely. It was no longer just fear, it was dread, palpable and suffocating. Shadows stretched longer than they should, twisting and writhing as though alive. The air was heavy, carrying a metallic tang that made my skin crawl. Luna's vigilance hadn't waned. She'd taken to pacing the bed, her growls growing louder, more desperate. I tried to ignore it, to dismiss the feeling that something was watching me. But then came the scratching. Faint at first, like nails brushing against the wall. It grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the corner. My blood turned to ice as I stared at the spot, willing the noise to stop. But it didn't. Instead, it was joined by a soft, rasping whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable: anger, hatred, malice. I ran to my parents' room that night, shaking and pale. I tried to explain, but the words felt hollow, ridiculous. They assured me it was just a series of bad dreams and let me sleep in their room. For a brief moment, I felt safe. Luna followed me, curling up at the foot of their bed, her eyes still darting toward the doorway. The next day, I begged my parents to let me sleep elsewhere, but they insisted I face my fears. Reluctantly, I returned to my room. I left every light on, my phone clutched tightly in my hand, ready to call for help at the first sign of anything unusual. Luna was there again, her constant vigil unwavering. This time, though, the tension was worse. It was as if the room itself was alive, breathing, waiting. Around midnight, the lights flickered and went out. Panic surged through me as I scrambled for my phone. The screen lit up, but before I could do anything, the camera opened again. My hands trembled as I saw my reflection. Behind me, the woman was there once more, closer this time. Her scream was audible now, deafening and otherworldly. It wasn't just a sound, it was a force, shaking the room and piercing my very being. I dropped the phone, but the image remained, projected onto the wall as if the device had fused with the room. Luna hissed and lunged toward the corner, her claws slashing at empty air. The shadows convulsed, forming shapes that writhed and clawed at her. I could barely move, rooted to the bed as the woman's face twisted into a grotesque grin. Her hands reached for me, her nails dripping with some black, tar-like substance. She spoke for the first time, her voice a guttural snarl that echoed in my mind, "You cannot escape." I screamed, a raw, primal sound that finally broke the paralysis. Grabbing Luna, I bolted from the room and slammed the door shut behind me. The air in the hallway was lighter, almost safe. My parents found me huddled on the floor, clutching Luna and sobbing incoherently. The days that followed were a blur. My parents, concerned but skeptical, suggested it was stress or an overactive imagination. I stayed out of my room as much as possible, but every time I passed by, I felt it watching. The whispers followed me, faint but persistent, echoing in the back of my mind even when I was nowhere near the house. One night, desperate for answers, I searched the history of the house. What I found chilled me to my core. Decades ago, a woman had lived there, reclusive and strange. She'd been accused of witchcraft by her neighbors and, in a fit of mob justice, was burned alive in what was now my bedroom. Her final curse was said to linger, a vow to torment anyone who dared occupy her space. I showed the article to my parents, but they dismissed it as sensationalism. To them, it was just an old ghost story. To me, it was validation and a warning. The final night in that house was the worst. The air was suffocating, the shadows alive and pulsating. Luna refused to enter the room, her growls replaced by pitiful, terrified yells. As I lay there, paralyzed with fear, the woman appeared again, no longer confined to reflections or corners. She stood at the foot of my bed, her body broken and charred, her eyes burning with hatred. She moved closer, her bony fingers outstretched. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her touch was icy, a searing cold that burned worse than fire. "Leave," she hissed, her voice reverberating through my skull. "Or suffer." I bolted from my parents' room, dragging them out of bed with a frenzy they couldn't ignore. By dawn, we were packed and gone, leaving the house and whatever inhabited it behind. Luna never growled again, but she remained wary, always watching the shadows. Even now, years later, I feel her presence. In darkened rooms, in fleeting reflections, in the cold that sometimes grips me without warning. She's waiting, biding her time. And every so often, I swear I hear the faintest whisper, "You cannot escape." When I was in 3rd grade, my family moved into a new house. At first glance, it seemed like a normal home, a little old, perhaps, but nothing unusual. As a child, I didn't notice the odd vibe that hung in the air. I was just excited about a new place to live. But from the very first night, the house began to reveal its true nature. That first night, my family and I all slept in one room since our beds were still being set up. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of laughter coming from the living room. But this wasn't ordinary laughter, it was loud, hysterical, and unhinged. As a child, my first thought was that it might be Santa Claus, but then I reasoned it could be a thief. I lay perfectly still, too scared to move, and eventually forced myself to fall back asleep. I told my mom about the laughter a few weeks later, but she brushed it off, telling me not to think too much of it. At the time, I didn't question her response, but looking back, it feels like the opening scene of a horror movie. Not long after, my sister, who was in 4th grade, had her own terrifying encounter. One morning, she woke up screaming. She swore she had seen a face staring at her as soon as she opened her eyes. It wasn't just any face, it was something demonic with twisted features and horns. She was pale and trembling as she told my mom, but again, my mom dismissed it as a bad dream. A few nights later, I had my most unsettling experience yet. I woke up to the sound of singing. It was soft, melodic, and coming from the foot of my bed. I sat up and looked, but no one was there. The sound continued, faint and ghostly, as if it was coming from another world. I wasn't scared at the time. I was a brave child and simply decided to ignore it. But the memory of that disembodied voice still haunts me. Adding to the unsettling atmosphere was our neighbor. Every morning at 6 a.m., she would stand in the parking lot of our building, talking and shouting to herself. She seemed to be having conversations with invisible people, her voice echoing through the cold morning air. My family and I tried to avoid her, but her presence only added to the feeling that something was deeply wrong with the place. The days turned into months, and while we eventually got used to the strange occurrences, they never completely stopped. Sometimes it was the sound of footsteps when no one was there, or the feeling of being watched, especially in the darker corners of the house. We lived in constant unease, but life went on. One evening, something happened that solidified the house's eerie reputation in my mind forever. I was in the kitchen getting a glass of water when I heard a faint whisper. It was so soft that at first, I thought it was my imagination. But then it grew louder, and I realized it was coming from the hallway. It sounded like someone was calling my name. I froze, clutching the glass in my hand, and peered into the dark corridor. There was nothing there, but the whispering continued, insistent and chilling. I ran back to the living room where my family was and didn't mention what I heard. I knew they wouldn't believe me anyway. The final straw came one night when my mom had her own encounter. She rarely admitted to being scared, but this time she couldn't hide it. She was in the laundry room late at night when she felt a cold hand brush against her arm. Thinking it was one of us, she turned around, but no one was there. She came back to the living room, visibly shaken, and sat down without saying a word. It was the first time I saw real fear in her eyes. Fast forward about 7 years. My family and I were reminiscing about that house, and I mentioned the incidents I had experienced. To my shock, my mom admitted that she had always felt the house was haunted. She hadn't told us at the time because she didn't want to scare us. She confessed that she often heard footsteps at night and once saw a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed. She had kept it all to herself, hoping that if she ignored it, it would go away. As we discussed these events, a detail surfaced that we had all overlooked at the time. The day we moved in, our dog had acted unusually strange. He had growled and barked at an empty corner of the living room, refusing to enter the space even when coaxed with treats. At the time, we thought he was just adjusting to the new environment, but now it felt like a warning we had failed to heed. Similarly, I remembered how the air in certain parts of the house would feel heavier, almost suffocating, especially in the hallway and near the basement door. My sister confessed that she often avoided those areas, feeling as if something unseen was watching her. One memory that sent shivers down my spine was an incident involving my brother. He was around 6 at the time and had an imaginary friend he called Mr. We all thought it was a harmless phase, but one day, he told us Mr. didn't like the basement and that we shouldn't go down there. When asked why, he simply said, "Because he's down there." Who he was, my brother never explained, and we never pressed him further, dismissing it as a child's fantasy. But now, that simple statement seemed loaded with a sinister implication. Looking back, I can't help but wonder what kind of energy lingered in that house. Was it the sign of something terrible? Were the strange happenings connected to the neighbor's bizarre behavior? One particularly chilling thought occurred to me during our conversation. What if the neighbor, with her odd morning rituals, was somehow in tune with the forces in the house? Had she seen something or communicated with the unseen entities? Her actions, while strange, now seemed less random and more purposeful, as though she were trying to keep something at bay. It wasn't just the paranormal that disturbed us, there was a palpable sense of sadness in that house, as if the walls themselves held memories too dark to forget. I often found myself drawn to a certain window overlooking the backyard, where I would sometimes see fleeting shadows move through the trees. It wasn't until much later that I learned the house's history, rumors of a family who had disappeared decades ago without explanation. The basement, in particular, had been the focus of these stories, with neighbors claiming they heard strange noises coming from it long after the family was gone. Even now, years later, I feel her presence. In darkened rooms, in fleeting reflections, in the cold that sometimes grips me without warning. She's waiting, biding her time. And every so often, I swear I hear the faintest whisper, "You cannot escape." The old house made spooky noises all the time. It groaned and creaked like an old monster waking up. I couldn't sleep, so I got up to get a drink of water. My heart was pounding like a drum. The stairs were dark and scary, and every step made a loud echo. The kitchen was dark and cold. I turned on the light, but it wouldn't turn off. I tried and tried, but the light stayed on. Then, I saw the other light switch was turned on, but I was alone in the house. I felt a chill go down my spine. It felt like someone else was in the house with me. I was so scared, I slammed the kitchen door shut and blocked it with chairs. I checked all the windows and doors to make sure they were locked. Then, I ran up the stairs as fast as I could, my heart beating like crazy. I hid under my covers and tried to pretend I wasn't scared. My cat, Luna, was curled up beside me, but she wasn't purring anymore. She was staring at the door, her ears twitching. Then, I heard it. Creaking noises from the basement. Luna hissed and stood up on her paws. The noises were slow and scary, like something heavy was walking up the stairs. Each step made a loud groan that made my blood run cold. Then, they stopped. But Luna was still scared. She kept looking at the basement door, her eyes wide. The house was so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat. Then, I heard scratching at the basement door. It sounded like someone was trying to get in. Luna let out a low growl and backed away from me. I was so scared I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The scratching stopped, and the house was silent again. It was a scary kind of silence, like the house was holding its breath. I lay there for a long time, listening. I was afraid to move, afraid to breathe. I felt like something was watching me, something evil and unseen. My eyes were wide open, but I couldn't see anything in the dark. Then, I heard it again. A soft thump, 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 coming from the basement. It sounded like someone was walking around down there. I closed my eyes and wished I could disappear. Suddenly, all the noises stopped. The house was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence. It was like the house was holding its breath, waiting. I lay there for a long time, listening. I was afraid to move, afraid to breathe. I felt like something was watching me, something evil and unseen. My eyes were wide open, but I couldn't see anything in the dark. I tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside the window made me jump. I kept thinking about the scratching at the door and the footsteps in the basement. The next morning, I woke up feeling tired and scared. I looked at Luna, but she was sleeping peacefully. I tried to convince myself that it was all just my imagination, that the old house was just making noises. But I couldn't shake off the feeling that something strange had happened in the house. I kept thinking about the glowing light switch, the creaking stairs, and the scratching at the door. I went downstairs to make some coffee, but the kitchen still felt cold and spooky. I checked the light switch again, but it worked fine now. I tried to forget about the night before, but it was hard. I spent the rest of the day trying to act normal, but I kept jumping at every little sound. I couldn't concentrate on anything. I felt like I was being watched, like something was always lurking just beyond my sight. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I kept hearing noises in the house, creaking floorboards, scratching sounds, and even whispers. I felt like the house was alive, that it was watching me and waiting for me to make a mistake. I stayed in bed all day, afraid to leave my room. I ordered pizza and watched TV, but I couldn't relax. The fear was always there, a cold hand gripping my heart. The next day, I decided I couldn't stay in the house anymore. I packed a bag and left. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just needed to get away from the scary old house. I drove for hours, not knowing where I was going. I stopped at a motel and checked in. I felt safe for the first time in days. I took a hot shower and tried to relax, but the fear was still there. I stayed at the motel for a few days, trying to forget about the scary old house. But I couldn't escape the memories. I kept seeing the glowing light switch, hearing the scratching at the door, feeling the cold fear that gripped my heart. Finally, I decided I had to go back. I couldn't run away from my problems forever. I drove back to the old house, my heart pounding with fear. The house looked the same, but it seemed even scarier now. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The silence was deafening. I walked through the house, checking every room, making sure I was alone. I went into the kitchen and turned on the light. It worked fine. I took a deep breath and tried to relax. I decided to stay in the house for a few days to see if I could face my fears. I spent my days cleaning the house, trying to make it feel less spooky. I opened the windows to let in some fresh air and sunlight. I started to feel a little better, but I was still jumpy. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside the window made me jump. One day, I was in the basement, cleaning out some old boxes. I found a dusty old photograph album. I opened it up and saw pictures of the previous owners of the house. There was a picture of a young girl standing in the kitchen, smiling at the camera. She looked happy and carefree, but there was something strange about her eyes. They seemed to be looking at me, following me as I moved around the room. I closed the album quickly, my heart pounding. I felt a chill go down my spine. I knew then that the house wasn't just haunted by noises and shadows. It was haunted by the memories of the people who had lived there before. I left the house that day and didn't go back. I sold it as soon as I could. I never wanted to see that house again. I still think about the old house sometimes, and I still get scared when I hear creaking noises at night. But I'm trying to move on. I'm trying to forget about the scary old house and the things that happened there. But sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I can still hear the whispers of the house, telling me its secrets, warning me to stay away.